Hello and welcome to another tutorial in the CSS series. In the previous tutorial, we looked at different CSS specificity rules and concluded that a CSS rule with an ID-based selector has greater precedence when compared to a CSS rule which has a tag name or a class name selector. And based on that, we were able to come up with a CSS rule with a greater specificity from line 37 to 39, and that took effect on the span element that we have on the browser. It has a color of aquamarine. In this tutorial, we'll be talking about two exceptions where a CSS specificity rule can be overwritten. That is, by using a style which is inline to the element. We all know that an inline CSS can be written using a style attribute. So the first thing that I would like to do is to overwrite the color of this span element. Now, as per the external style sheet, the color which is belonging to the specificity rule, which has the highest specificity here, will be overwritten by the color that is mentioned in the inline CSS. If that is true, if I go back and do a refresh, we can confirm that that is the case. What this means is uh, a CSS rule which is part of an inline CSS has a greater specificity than a CSS rule which has the highest specificity in an external style sheet. So technically, an inline CSS style has the highest specificity. Now, let's talk about another method where a CSS specificity can be broken or overwritten. This is done by using a keyword called as important. I'm going to demonstrate that by adding the same selector as a previous rule and giving this a color of, let's say, dark green. Okay. Now, when I save this, there should it should still continue to have this color, but when I add another keyword called exclamation important, this keyword is going to override the current styling on the span element uh, by breaking or ignoring all the CSS specificity rules. So whenever we add a keyword called exclamation important, it doesn't care about any of the specificity rules and it directly interacts with the element and changes the color of that HTML element. Let's just make sure that that is the case. As we can see, the color of the span element has changed to dark green. There is another important thing to note here. So we could break the CSS specificity rules. I mean, to confirm that exclamation important doesn't care about specificity rules, I'm going to give this another uh, rule. I'm going to change this rule slightly by changing the selector to the lowest specificity rule. So in this case, I'm going to add a tag name, but I'm going to retain the important keyword. Now, as per the specificity rule, anything which has a tag name as its selector has the lowest precedence when compared to something like an ID or a class name, right? But once we add important, it should ignore everything. What it means is it's going to ignore the specificity rules. So if I go back and refresh, it should continue to have the color as dark green. So that is a proof that exclamation important ignores the specificity rules. Having said that, we should try to avoid using inline styles and the keyword exclamation important as much as possible. We shouldn't try to use that while styling our CSS, and we should restrict ourselves to add CSS only from one source following the specificity rules, which is from the external style sheet. I think the only case where we want to use or overwrite the existing styles is when we do not have control over the CSS. For example, there are cases where we import CSS libraries from different um, so from different libraries. There is a possibility of importing CSS from libraries, and then if we do not have control over those styles directly for us to edit, then that is a case where we could use a CSS specificity rule to overwrite it. If that is not possible, as a last resort, we can use exclamation important to override that style. But as I said before, we should try to avoid this as much as possible, as it breaks the cascading rules of CSS and ignores all the specificity rules. I hope that this is clear, and I just wanted to cover this tutorial to showcase these two exceptions. In the next video, I'll be talking about another important topic called as the CSS box model. So have a good day, and I'll see you in the next video.